Hello and welcome to Essential Macroeconomics, Packs 1 to 6. We're going to look at some of the key essential theories in this sort of Year 12 material and some quick recap questions as ever for you to think about whilst we go through. So a reminder that the Essential Economics questions are ones that are tested regularly in the exam, or could be fundamental theories that could go into many different exam questions. And the locks you see on the top right hand side of the PowerPoint show how regular they're coming up. One lock, essential topic, triple lock comes up every single year. So these are the packs we're going to look at today. Now this is the ADS model. This is from pack 4, but this is probably the key thing for Year 12 economics really. I mean, it's even beyond that into Year 13, but you can use it in so many situations, in your essays, your 15 mark, your longer questions. You can use it to take any factor in a question and think what the effects are in terms of growth or jobs or inflation. Policies, you wanted to put these in to show interest rate changes or supply side policies. But also if you've got a question on what caused inflation or caused growth or caused unemployment, then maybe you could think about using the diagram to illustrate that. Now, there's still other diagrams you can use in Year 13, but ADAS is still so fundamental, you'd want to use that where you think it's appropriate, even if it's a Year 13 question. So there are a few different versions of the diagrams that you can use. So top you can see increased AD, increased SRAS, and increased LRS. So with the AD one, I think typically what you'll probably do is you'll use the Keynesian one. That's absolutely fine. The bottom one here on the LRS. You can use short and aggregate supply, but as we'll see later on, having this sort of different slopes of LRS is very useful for evaluation. So when I want to use short and aggregate supply, it's mainly, if not exclusively, when I'm doing short and aggregate supply questions. So things on cost of production, things on energy costs, oil prices, high minimum wage, these sort of things could affect short and aggregate supply, and that's when I would show it. And then long aggregate supply, I don't have a major preference between the classical at the top there or the Keynesian. Either of those is absolutely fine, as long as you show a drop in price level and an increase in real GDP. Remember, the LRS factors are all those shifts in the PPF, your education, healthcare, AI, productivity, etc. So when you're doing the diagram, you've got to think what's caused it. Is it one of the components of AD, cost of production, shifts in the PPF, and use the diagrams appropriately. Of course, you've got to make sure you keep your axes accurate. You don't want to lose marks on that price level and real GDP to show a macro diagram. As I say, for the AD shift, you can show an increase as follows, or a decrease, obviously going the opposite way. And P1, P2, Y and Y2 referring to those in your answer. Short and aggregate supply, say this is the one where I tend to, if I'm shifting short and aggregate supply, obviously got to have that in my diagram. So here, that's an increase in short and aggregate supply. So be careful, same with supply in micro. Think about what's going on here. So if there's lower oil prices or something causing this, then you can see price level go down. The way to think about the short and aggregate supply curve is shifting right or shifting left rather than up and down. And therefore you'll always get that right. But the double check is, look what's happened to inflation and real GDP. Does it match the factor you're talking about? Now there is a distinction between classical and Keynesian economics. Now this isn't heavily tested, it's still triple locked here because it's part of the aggregate demand and supply model, but they could ask you about why there's a difference between those two, thinking back to stuff we did about wage changes and sticky wages and that sort of thing. And therefore you've got two different situations, one where you can be below full employment in the long run in the Keynesian view, and therefore they'd advocate boosted aggregate demand to get back up to full employment. Whereas a classical school believe it will automatically adjust back to full employment. I've not put YFE in there, but there should be YFE next to the LRAS, so it just naturally back to the equilibrium as long as markets are allowed to work freely. So there could be a very specific question on that. Often it's your choice which of these you use. People tend to have a preference for Keynesian. You can always use classical as an evaluation point to contrast different views. Then long run aggregate supply. Okay, so I've used here the Keynesian one. I've shifted it out. Key thing there when you're doing it on the Keynesian one is you make sure your aggregate demand curve is on the upward sloping part of LRS, because you really want to show that drop in price level and increase in real GDP. Now, of course, you can sort of shift both together in terms of aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. And this is very effective in long answer questions or in your essays where you might have, say it was population going up, you can have more demand through consumption and then a bigger workforce through LRS going on. So you can have this short-term, long-term effect you can have here, or it could extend your analysis. If you get a diagram question as a full marker in the exam, it is best to just shift one curve. You can always get full marks shifting one curve. So in all the past papers we've seen, unless they actually specify two curves. So I'd shift one of them, but in the longer questions, shifting both is quite a good idea. And thinking about what factors could do that. So I think about investment in the recap question, but things like education spending, healthcare spending, basically sort of interventionist supply side policy would do this as well. And as I said earlier, like you can obviously illustrate different things with the diagram. So here we've got this difference between actual growth and potential growth. Actual growth, what's actually happening currently in the economy, affected by aggregate demand and short and aggregate supply changes, and your potential, your long-term growth rate, determined by LRAS. So again, if you have a question on what's causing economic growth, you can use those, or any time, if you can think of what your factor in the question is, and it shifts out a curve, then it's going to increase real GDP, and that could be one of your macro effects in your longer question or in your essay. In a similar way, you could do the same thing with inflation. So anytime AD shifts out, you've got demand pull inflation. A reduction in short and aggregate supply could lead to cost push inflation. So again, depends what the question is, but if it's asking, if there's a cause of inflation question, it's a 15 marker or an essay, then really you'd want to draw some diagrams to illustrate those different types of inflation. And then the output gaps. So this is a little bit niche, but again, it's fundamental. I'm just showing you how you can use ADAS across all these different topics and why aggregate demand supply is a triple locked topic. So the output gap, so we're going to draw a negative one. So that's full employment there, where everyone who wants a job has a job in the economy. However, if your aggregate demand curve is lower, and therefore you're at Y1, then that how far below full employment you are will give you a negative output gap. So there, the negative output gap is A. And I say if you're a Keynesian, then you'd be wanting to try and boost aggregate demand, maybe through government spending, to reduce the output gap. Classical school would think obviously wages would fall and get back to full employment anyway. And then obviously the positive output gap, you can show these ones on classical or Keynesian. I'm showing the ones that's easier to illustrate here. So in this situation, maybe at full employment there, P1, initiate AD1. AD1 went to AD2. Temporarily, you could have a positive output gap at Y1 because your output level is, your GDP is above your potential, above full employment, and therefore you have a positive output gap there. You can label that A or B or whatever you want to call that between there. And then thinking about your evaluation, use aggregate demand and supply. So I think the reason we use the Keynesian LRS curve for aggregate demand shifts is that you can show it depends where you are on the curve. Now this is the higher order evaluation. Just saying there's going to be inflation as a conflict, or as a conflict between growth and inflation evaluation, is a very common point. But if you can say that potentially it depends where on the curve you are, and you think about which economy you're talking about. So if the UK was, say, below full employment, it's more likely to have an effect on GDP than price level. That's very high order. And you can use diagrams in your evaluation to illustrate that. Similarly, you could talk about, with the middle one, about the fact that if LRAS shifts out, it's less effective when aggregate demand is very low. Here you can see there's no impact. And then also, shifting aggregate demand, the classical evaluation is all it's going to do is temporarily boost real GDP to Y1. But then, due to higher wages, inflation and wage costs, it'll get it back to full employment. So only a temporary boost in real GDP. So the left-hand one and the far right-hand one, good ways to evaluate aggregate demand shifts. So that was aggregate demand and supply. Now, the circular flow of income was the first thing we studied, and you can still utilise that in your answer. Using phrases like injections and withdrawals, and as we'll look in a second at multiplier effects, is very useful. And it also has all the components of aggregate demand in here as well. So consumption going round, then I, G, and X minus M. So all the aggregate demand factors are actually in the circular flow. So when you're talking about that, if you're talking about investment or government spending or exports, you can talk about injections happening. Remember, consumption isn't an injection in the circular flow. It's just money flowing around the circular flow of income. It's not one of the injections. And when we studied this, you can also talk about net injections and net withdrawals. So, for example, the trade deficit would be a net withdrawal because there's more withdrawals than there are injections. But if you're just talking about one factor, like government spending, that's an injection. If it's something to do with the budget deficit, and that could be, because it's two factors, it is net. So that's one of the key things when you're explaining the circular flow of income. It's one factor, say it's injection withdrawal. If it's two related factors like the trade deficit, the budget deficit, then you can talk about the net effect of that as one way of explaining it. And then linked to that, the multiplier effect, and this is quite common, probably more common than the circular flow itself. It's this idea of the injection you put into the economy leads to a bigger increase in income than just that initial injection. And the key is knowing why. So this idea, if it's HS2, more jobs, more consumption, more profits for firms, therefore higher wages, therefore more consumption, and it carries on. So that's what's called the multiplier process. Lots of questions usually calculating this. You can see the different marginal propensities here, and there's a little calculation you could do there on the right. So these marginal propensities, you can get an actual value for what the multiplier is. So that's very useful. Remember these marginal propensities, what do they mean? So marginal propensity, for example, MPC, it's the change in consumption from a change in income. So for example, if you got £100 extra, how much of that would you spend? Or MPW, if you got £100 extra, how much wouldn't you spend? And remember that the saving taxation imports are obviously all the types of withdrawal that you can get. So they're all equivalent formulae there. Another thing that you can sort of do to sort of improve your answer, therefore, is if you know there's a multiplier effect, then it's often good to show it with a double shift in aggregate demand. And that will give you a bit more extension to your analysis. So when aggregate demand is going up due to government spending HS2, there's more jobs creating more income and more consumption, you can do double shift, and that will show your multiplier effect doing a multiple impact on GDP. And the macroeconomic objectives, I mean, I've put this as one lock. I mean, they're always fundamentally, you know what they are. But there's so many different things they could test on this. And it's worth thinking through in the recap question. When you're doing these, what are the measures? So like RPI and CPI, or I11 claimant counts, or the components of the current account. What causes them? You've seen a little bit of that already in the PowerPoint. What are the effects? How do you improve it? And that's a good sort of checklist to go through with the macroeconomic objectives. But it is fundamental. They could obviously ask you to talk about macroeconomic objectives in a longer question. Also, when you see a macroeconomic effects question, I tend to think about this list of things to go through. So it is fundamental, but there's so many different little mini topics in those different macroeconomic objectives. There's bound to be something on growth and inflation and unemployment and in the exam, but probably you don't know what sort of type it will be. But those fundamentally knowing what those are and then thinking about the causes, effects, measurement, and policies is really useful. And then policy, so you've got monetary policy, so interest rates and quantitative easing, also exchange rate policy. Think about the Bank of England doing this, that's essential. It's not the government, and some of the limitations that they may have here, especially this conflict between objectives. You can't achieve all your objectives in monetary policy. The other demand side policy is fiscal, so those go together in terms of demand side policy, taxation, government spending. This is the government, this is the budget. And again, the fact you can't achieve all your objectives simultaneously. And that difference between fiscal and supply side, they're both done by the government, and they're probably both involve a lot of time government spending and taxation, but they're specifically looking to focus at long and aggregate supply and boosting that. And remember that distinction between interventionist and market-based. So knowing that distinction, it's a good way of structuring an answer potential on supply side policies. You can look at interventionist and market-based. Interventionist, where you're doing more government spending, more regulation. Whereas market-based, where you're cutting spending, cutting regulation, cutting taxation. So it's when you're moving towards the free market, the market-based ones. And obviously the significant time lag is often one we'll talk about here, the budget implications, the opportunity cost. But sometimes there's different downsides depending on intervention and market-based. So if you're saying cutting welfare as a market-based one, that could affect equality. Whereas if it's like big spending on HS2, that's quite a big budgetary issue. So they have subtly different ones. So the market-based ones tend to be more efficient, but tend to have more issues with inequality. And then conflicts. So conflicts can be asked in its own right, but it's quite a nice way of it's quite a good evaluation point. And in terms of what the conflicts mean, they can be conflicts between the objectives themselves. So the question could be about what are the conflicts for more economic growth? And you might think, well, more inequality, more environmental damage, demand pull inflation. So the objectives will conflict. And then there's conflicts from using the policy. So as a policymaker, because the objectives conflict, you therefore have to make choices about what you do. So you might decide to raise interest rates to reduce inflation from the Iran war, but this can conflict with economic growth. So you've got that conflict from using a policy between its objectives. And then potentially between the policies themselves. So crowding out, as we'll see in a couple of slides' time. So crowding out could mean that if you're doing lots of borrowing for fiscal policy, it could drive up interest rates, conflict with monetary policy. If you're doing lots of supply side policies, higher interest rates may affect that as well in some ways. So higher interest rates could conflict with supply side. So it's quite a nice topic, conflicts. It can be asked specifically, but a lot of the time it's you using that as a good way of evaluating some of the policies or effects you're talking about. And then sort of moving into the final bit in terms of packs 5 and 6. So public expenditure is slightly less tested than the other parts of this pack, but these key essential things, current expenditure, capital expenditure, transfer payments, and this crowding out effect, resource crowding out, financial crowding out, the fact that the government spends more money, the private sector may spend less money. Think about some of the reasons why that might occur. And then taxation, slightly more tested actually taxation, and these different types, direct, indirect, regressive, progressive, proportional. You should really know how some of these taxes work, so the big ones, so corporation tax, tax on profits, the different income tax bands, national insurance being charged to employees and employers, indirect tax, tax on goods and services. So knowing some examples will really help give some context to your answers. And then you can see the Laffer curve here. So this is a nice one you can use. Here it's showing you the fact that if you get too far, if your tax rate rises from T3 to T4, then your revenue may fall R3 to R4. And for example, if you put up corporation tax, you're getting more tax per profit, but maybe less, so fewer firms may actually produce in the economy because of high corporation tax. So if lots of businesses left the country, even if the corporation tax is higher, you might get less tax revenue overall because there are fewer companies paying tax. And this is called the substitution effect, outweighing the income effect. So it's worth knowing the income effect, substitution effect, Laffer curve. If you get anything on taxation, it's a lovely evaluation point that you can use. And then the final little bit of the Pack 5, so budget deficit, national debt. Again, lots of these little distinctions. Deficit, accumulating national debt, structural deficit that stays there irrespective of the trade cycle, and the cyclical deficit does not. The choice to use discretionary fiscal policy, whereas automatic stabilisers will automatically try and reduce the fluctuation in the trade cycle through progressive taxation and unemployment benefits. I mean, obviously this is very topical in terms of huge budget deficits and national debt, why that could be an issue, and what would you do about it? Should you put taxes up or cut spending? So quite a few things given how topical national debt is there. inequality and poverty. There's usually something in this pack somewhere in the exam, but I thought it would be good to emphasise that difference between inequality, which is all about the rich, highest income versus lowest income, versus poverty, where you're potentially either absolutely poor, so you're below a sort of certain income poverty line, you can't afford goods and services, essential goods and services, and relative poverty, where you are relative to other people on you're poor. Key thing is poverty is about the bottom end of the income distribution, but inequality is both. So it's slightly different. They are related, obviously, but like it's important if you get a question on inequality and poverty, you make sure you talk about the right one. And the same with income and wealth inequality, knowing that distinction, and therefore the causes are slightly different but can overlap, and the policies to change them could be slightly different as well. And remember that you've got the Lorenz curve, and you can use this to calculate the Gini coefficient. Remember, this is about income inequality. This is not wealth inequality. It's not different forms of poverty. So drawing that, if you get something on income inequality, the causes of it, you can add that into your answer to sort of show the impact. And here's an inward shift and showing you that it's going to be less inequality because nearer the line of equality, and that will reduce the Gini coefficient. Okay, so that was the Essential Macroeconomics Packs 1 to 6. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.